Welcome to Crosshatched. There's a debate video that dropped recently I've been dying to watch. It's conservative Christian and toxic empathy author Allie Stuckey debating Monte, a former Christian nationalist who ironically did not become an atheist. In fact, she runs well-attended Bible studies. Monte has over 4 million subs over 5 social media platforms. Allie has 2.7 million subs over 4 platforms. The host of the debate, Jubilee, has over 10 million subscribers on YouTube alone. I think we're going to learn a lot.
Welcome to Face Off, where two people debate 4 claims. 1 clock, no interruptions.
Except
Today,
me.
Allie Stuckey, a best-selling author, Christian conservative, and host of Relatable, faces off against Monte, a former far-right Christian nationalist turned progressive political commentator. The clock starts now.
My first face-off claim is Christians must oppose abortion.
Let's get into it.
Define abortion medically. It means the termination of any pregnancy before viability. So that includes ectopic pregnancies in cases of abuse. That includes stillbirths. It includes clearing a partial miscarriage. It even includes miscarriage itself as denoted by spontaneous abortion. I think in just that list, there are several of those that Christians could get behind and support, if not fully. But again, we get to the history of abortion in the church, throughout the early church, that it was not considered murder. St. Augustine decided that until the quickening, until viability, it was not considered a crime or murder in the church. That was changed by Pope Pius IX in 1869. And the evangelical community within the 20th century didn't really care that much about it. It wasn't a motivator for their voting bloc, and it really wasn't something they rallied around. In fact, in 1968, Christianity Today hosted 25 theologians who really debated abortion. Is it right? Is it wrong? When can it happen? When shouldn't it happen? And they all agreed collectively that in all or some cases, it should be permissible. You're part of the Southern Baptist Church Convention, which acknowledged the right of abortion, supported it in 3 separate church edicts, as did the Dallas Theological Seminary, saying that they believed that a woman's right to her body and autonomy superseded all else, and that abortion should be permissible in incest cases, as well as for the mental, physical, and spiritual health of the mother. The overwhelming evangelical community supported the passage of Roe. But then we get to segregation academies and conservative Christian colleges losing tax-exempt status due to racial discrimination policies, specifically Bob Jones in 1977, when they lost their tax-exempt status due to admissions practices that were racially discriminatory, as well as a dating ban on interracial couples that they had in place until the year 2000. They just a few years ago got their tax-exempt status back. The religious right was able to mobilize on that issue, on desegregation, and get the evangelical voting bloc up. 1978, Jerry Falwell gives his first anti-abortion speech from Thomas Road Baptist Church. And then by 1979, Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell have established the moral majority, the religious right, and now abortion is a big voting issue. Paul Weyrich, the founder of the Heritage Foundation, would say to Randall Balmer in an interview in the 90s, I could not get evangelicals to come out and vote against abortion. I could not get them to come out against feminism. I could not get them to come out against the queer community. But as soon as they came after segregation practices and discrimination practices in the schools, I was able to rally the vote. So from the beginning of the church all the way until we're going to talk specifically the evangelical bloc, 1978, 1979, are you saying that everyone in between there was not a Christian?
I'm saying everything in between what you just described is wrong. Again, this is not a salvific argument. This is about what is right and what is wrong. And I'm really not interested in all of the people throughout church history who are wrong about a number of things. That's not really relevant to my argument. My argument is that killing an innocent person is always wrong. And if we are human beings, scientifically, if we're human beings at the moment of conception, the debate really isn't about when human life begins. That's agreed upon. What the debate is over is when personhood begins. When does a human become a person? When does a human have rights? When does a human have value? I think the morally safest, and of course the biblically safest too, position is to say, you know what? All human beings, no matter how small, no matter how young, no matter their location, are people that have rights. Because once we start playing the game of, well, some human beings who are human, they're not really people. They don't have rights. We get into the conversation of whether women are full people or whether slaves are full people or whether people of a certain religion or a certain background are full people. Any time after conception for designating personhood to a person is arbitrary, because then you're basing it on things that you would never apply to someone outside of the womb. You don't justify the murder of someone based on their location. You don't justify the murder of someone based on their dependence upon someone else or their dependence upon a machine. You don't justify the murder of someone because of their age or because of their size. But those are all of the reasons given when it comes to the justification of killing babies inside the womb. I don't give a rip about what Jerry Falwell thought. I'm talking about the murder of people. And I think killing an innocent person is always wrong, and you don't.
How
So
can you
I
say
want
it's a person?
to talk about definitions a little bit, because I know that it's emotionally compelling to say killing babies. It's not a baby. That's not me being contrarian. That's accuracy. Embryo up to the end of 8 weeks, and then we have a fetus. And I think it's very important so that we're actually getting to the facts of the matter. But what we are saying is, we are not saying you can go up and kill someone anytime you want. The distinction here is, do my organs, does my bloodstream, does my marrow have to keep them alive? Do I have to put myself in harm's way or risk death in order for this life to be viable? I think you have an absolutely solid argument after viability. But we know that that is not when the bulk of abortions happen. The late second and third trimester is almost exclusively for fatal fetal abnormalities, stillbirths, partial miscarriages, and medical emergencies. And medical professionals should be allowed to make that call in conjunction with their patient and their patient's safety. But also, biblically, I would love to know your biblical argument for life beginning at conception.
Well, let me back up just a little bit. First of all, fetus is Latin for small child. And so we can get into the semantics of it. It's all a human being. I mean, just because we call a child a toddler or we call a child a baby doesn't mean that it's not a child, doesn't mean that it's not a human. Adolescent, teen, these are all different designations that we use for different stages of life. That doesn't change the value of someone. Viability, extremely arbitrary standard for whether or not a person should be murdered. I mean, we're not just talking about, okay, is it okay for the dentist to pull a tooth? We are talking about, is it okay for a doctor, for an abortion provider to be able to inject the heart of a baby to cause cardiac arrest and then induce delivery to kill that baby and then to throw that baby away like toxic waste? That's what we're talking about. And so if we're going to find standards for when that's okay, we better be sure. And when it comes to viability, that's changing. It used to be 24 weeks. Now there's babies as young as 19 weeks that are born prematurely and are able to survive. I don't think that you're for restricting abortion at 19 weeks. I mean, that would make you kind of radical. That would make you in line with some of the actually pro-life legislation that has been passed for banning abortion after, say, 20 weeks. I just find it so hypocritical that those who say that they care about human rights, say that they care about compassion, they care about empathy, they care about all of these things, to say, because I can't see this person, because this person requires a uterus and a placenta to survive, they're an object. They can be killed. I think all people have value from the moment of conception onward. I think that killing an innocent person is always wrong. No matter what, no matter where they're located. You disagree with that. You ask, what is my biblical support for life beginning at conception? Again, I think I already answered that. And scientifically, human life begins at conception. And if I see that all people are made in the image of God, if I read Psalm 139, that God knit us together in our mother's womb, that he saw my unformed substance. So even that embryo that doesn't really look like a baby, he saw that. Okay, wow, life inside the womb really matters. The safest and most consistent place that I can put the value of human life is when a human becomes a human. Again, any time after that is arbitrary. So thou shalt not murder makes the Big Ten, and abortion is murder.
So murder requires legal personhood. And again, if you're making this a biblical argument about Christians, the Bible is very clear that life begins at first breath. Adam was not alive until he breathed. Nefesh, ruach, the spirit is bound to the air. In Ezekiel, the bones don't come alive until ruach, the breath, comes upon them. It's required. That's how the Talmud understands it. That's how ancient Hebrew understood it. That was the consensus opinion of the ancient world in the New Testament. And you'd say Psalms 139, that's poetry. We never interpret poetry literally, except in this instance. But in that same thing where David is describing his relationship with God, in that same passage, he talks about being knit together in the bowels of the earth or in the depths of the earth. We don't make an argument that people are being birthed and built in the center of the earth. We know that it's not literal. We don't get to take that one verse and say, oh, it's literal now. That's very, very different. It's also, again, it comes back to autonomy, using someone's organs to keep someone else alive and not having the right to make that decision. But again, you make the biblical argument. The biblical argument still says that life begins at first breath. Human life is not the same as personhood. You said the same thing. Personhood requires a certain degree of consciousness, autonomy, personality that make us people. That's why it's not murder to pull the plug on someone who's brain dead. Their body is there. They may be functioning, but their personality, their consciousness that makes them a human being is gone. And that is a very, very big difference. And you talk about murder a lot, and it's always wrong. What about God killing all of the firstborn in Egypt?
Well, let's go back to some of your claims. Life starting at first breath. I think it's interesting that you take that passage literally. I didn't know that you took the creation accounts so literally and that you use that to then prescribe what you think about morality and legislation. So that's interesting. Psalm 139 is absolutely poetic, but as you know, you're a creative, you're a writer, you're very good at that. Even if it's not literal, it speaks to something that is true. All throughout the Psalms, we see that even when he's not speaking literally, he is speaking to something that is true, that is biblically true, even in some ways, I would say humanly true, scientifically true. My argument, again, it's very simple, that it is always wrong to kill an innocent person. I don't have the answers truly for all of the things that God prescribed or described or prohibited or allowed that don't make sense to me in the Old Testament. But my concern is what is happening today is that babies in the womb, and if you want to call them zygotes and fetus, because that kind of desensitizing language, I think, in the euphemisms make people feel better about what abortion is. At the end of the day, it is a human being. That's not scientifically contested. It's not a dolphin. It's not a summer squash. It's always
Looks
a human
like one.
being. Whether or not it's alive is also not contested. If it's not alive, then okay, you've miscarried. That's different. But if you've got a living human inside of you, that is what it is. And really the debate is over whether or not that human being matters and has rights. It sounds to me like your argument is that we should allow abortion through all 9 months for any reason. And maybe even after birth, if life doesn't start,
come
according to your
on.
view, until first breath,
Come
the babies that
on.
are born not breathing, which happens very often, I guess, aren't really people yet. And so I'm curious, like, do you believe in the allowance of abortion through all 9 months? And maybe even in some cases after?
I base my opinion on facts. 93% of abortions happen before 13 weeks. Only 7% happen after that. And in the late second and third trimester, women are not going to go through 6, 7, 8 months of pregnancy and then just be like, just kidding. Had my baby shower, put it in my nursery. Now I'm not going to do it. Those are almost exclusively medical emergencies, cancer diagnoses, and fatal fetal abnormalities. Women and doctors should make that decision, not a politician. But you have not established why you believe the Bible says life at conception outside of a poem that you have decided to interpret that way. You have also not addressed my question of, if you believe murder is always wrong, how do you justify God killing the firstborn? Because that's integral to your argument.
Actually, I addressed both of those things. I didn't say that Psalm 139 specifically tells us that a zygote, or at this point of fertilization, that human becomes a person, or that person becomes valuable. I actually did not say that. I said scientifically, we know when human life starts. It starts at fertilization. Even a pro-choice secular scientist could tell you, okay, yeah, technically this is when you have your own DNA, when it becomes human, uniquely human. I am saying because, not only because of thou shalt not murder, but also because of what I see throughout scripture about the sanctity of human life, that all people are made in the image of God. Yes, Psalm 139 is part of that, wow, it seems to me from that God is talking about the principle of caring about even the unformed substance, that he sees that he's knitting that together. I obviously don't think that literally means knitting. I think that he is speaking to the principle that we are made with dignity by a God who sees us and knows us and loves us. It is that principle that I am wedding with the scientific reality that we are human from the moment of conception. When I wed those two things together, I do not see a justification for killing a baby inside the womb. Now, I placed it.
It's like, there it is. What we get into here is a few things. You haven't identified that the Bible says life begins at conception. You haven't identified when personhood begins, and you haven't given a justification for why someone should be forced to volunteer their organs or possibly risk their life. That should only be the decision of the person that is facing that risk. That is the core argument, is autonomy, but you haven't provided a scriptural argument. You haven't provided a personhood argument, and you also haven't addressed the issue of autonomy. The reality is that everyone should be able to make that choice. Christians should be able to affirm abortion, especially in cases of an incest. How could a just God force that on a child? They could also say, no, I want doctors making that decision because it's going to save more women's lives. Because the reality is abortion bans increase maternal and infant mortality rates. Also, to your point about afterbirth abortions, that has never been real. Infanticide has always been illegal. That has not been allowed in this country ever. But the reality is that doctors should make those decisions. Abortion bans not only increase abortions, they also increase how many women and infants die. And if we really care about life, everyone's life has to matter. Everyone's life, that mother's life, the fetus's life. What world are they coming into? Is there drug addiction? Is there food for them? We don't get to claim that we're pro-life and then pass policies that kill women and also refuse to support the social structures and systems that would protect children born in impoverished homes, into drug addiction, and decide that we're going to remove those and then demonize especially single parents. Those cannot both be pro-life at the same time. But there isn't a biblical stance that says abortion is murder. That is not a biblical stance. You can have that opinion, but the Bible doesn't align with it.
Single parent here. I love my 3 children. They've been so fun raising. I've raised them by myself since they were 9, 3, and 1. And I know I get to spend more time with my kids than 90% of dads out there. And still, when they're all grown up and out of the house, I know it wasn't enough time. I'm going to disagree with both of them a little bit. This is a very unconventional perspective on abortion. Hear me out. I do kind of believe the argument, like, you know, the human life or spirit, whatever, begins at conception. But I also believe, as Emanuel Swedenborg has said, that all babies, and I presume fetuses and young children who die, go straight to heaven. And they're raised by angels. So, if you are forcing women to have babies by making abortion illegal, I mean, just statistically, some of those babies are going to grow up into adolescence. They're growing up in a home where they weren't necessarily wanted. Yeah, don't try to tell me about the adoption system. You know how many parents out there are adopting kids just for the revenue stream from the government? Listen, statistically, a lot of these babies who would have been aborted, they're going to grow up to adults. And a certain amount of them are not going to turn into good people. And their afterlife is risking hell. So in some ways, by banning abortion, you are sending people to hell. Like I said, it's very unconventional, but I don't know. I think that there actually is some accuracy in that. And the last thing I'll say on the subject is that as I was telling my daughter today, I do feel that on a certain level, women, not female fetuses, right? Women are more important. If it came down to the survival of the species, and you had 50 women and 5 men, you are more likely to keep the human species alive than if you had 50 men and 5 women. So on that basic level of survival, the women are kind of more important. And if a woman has become pregnant, right, whether she gets an abortion or not, she has demonstrated the ability that she can get pregnant. Not all women can get pregnant. So if a woman becomes pregnant and she decides it is not the right time, we should respect that. And otherwise, I defer to Monte's stats that these abortions are happening very early when legal. And nobody's killing babies after birth. Come on. Let's continue, shall we?
Got through one. Now I got it.
Oh, we definitely could have gotten longer.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh no.
My first face-off claim is patriarchy, not feminism, is at odds with Christ's ministry and teaching.
Can you define patriarchy and feminism for me?
Patriarchy is a social system in which men are at the top and dominate most power. They also predominate leadership, social and moral authority, privilege, as well as property ownership. It is a vertical authority system that puts men at the top and everyone else underneath. Feminism is the ideology and advocacy for the economic, social, and political equality of all the sexes.
There you
My
go.
argument would be that Christ elevates, of course, the status and the dignity of women. I would say the New Testament in general does that, but certainly we see Jesus attend to women that were not only considered outsiders because they were women, but because they were bleeding for 11 years, or because they were a woman of the night, or because they were caught in adultery. And the fact that the New Testament writers decided to include these accounts, or the woman who just wanted to be in his presence and wanted the crumbs from his table, or the woman at the well who had 5 husbands and Jesus read her like a book. We see over and over again, Jesus affirmed the dignity and the sanctity of women as people made in God's image. I believe that we see that also reflected throughout the New Testament. I wouldn't agree that that's the same thing as feminism. I don't know whether or not I disagree about your claim when it comes to patriarchy. I don't call myself a patriarchalist or a patriarchist. I would call myself a traditional complementarian, and that I do affirm Ephesians 5, that husbands are the head of the wives as Christ is the head of the church, that wives submit to your husbands as to the Lord, and husbands love your wives as you love yourself, which is a very high calling. And so I'm not sure exactly where we disagree, but maybe you can go a little bit deeper into your argument and we can see where the fissures lie.
The primary focus is that women have complete spiritual authority as well. The idea of complementarianism is a falsehood disguised in separate but equal language. It says women and men just have totally different roles, but it's the same. But when you are constituting a system of relationships that many conservative churches teach, right, that the woman must submit. Many of them are now pushing for headship voting, right, where the man only gets to cast a vote, the woman does not. When you create a system where only one person gets leadership, only one person gets authority, only one person gets resources. And then for people that oppose no-fault divorce, one person really truly can't leave unless there's extreme abuse. That is by definition an inequitable relationship. It has financial inequity. There is not autonomy in that relationship. And typically the way it plays out in church systems, we see it over and over. We see women who are abused and told to be long-suffering, or a man is unfaithful and they're told they need to submit more. So much gets put on women because you're secondary to him. Right. You are supposed to submit to him. And in terms of Ephesians and Colossians, both of which are now up for debate for Pauline authorship, they're likely written by a Pauline school, Colossians coming first, Ephesians copied from that. But you're resting on the household rules, the reflection of the Greco-Roman household rules that happen in that passage. But in Ephesians 6:5, again, we get back to slaves obey your masters. So are we actually adhering to also Paul's ethic that slaves are not only permissible, but please be good and behave? Because we have to take the whole or the part. So my two debates are that complementarianism leads to inequitable relationships for women. Churches also push women out of church leadership and do not allow them full spiritual authority they allow for men. And then also, if we're going to call on Paul and the household codes to justify this, we have to take them all in their entirety. If slavery and obeying your masters is culturally bound, then so is the entire passage.
Okay, let's see which point I want to address first. It does seem like Paul is regulating some existing institutions in that culture at the time. I disagree that he was simply aligning with them and affirming them. When he says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, making himself a sacrifice to her so that he might purify her, sanctify her, all of these things, that would have been very countercultural at the time. I think we can agree that in that time, women were not seen as full people. They weren't seen as people with the fullness of the logos, the fullness of the capacity to reason, which was really how the scholars at the time determined whether you were a full person and could be treated as someone with rights and dignity. Children were seen as less than, women slaves, the elderly, the sick, really only the adult-free male in that pagan culture was seen as having the fullness of the Logos. And then Christ changed that. He became the Logos. John 1 calls him the Word made flesh. So the capital L Logos came down and said, no, your worth, your dignity, your personhood is actually not defined by your capacity to reason. It's not defined by your gender, male or female. It is defined by me. And I say, not only are you made in the image of God, but also you're equally dead in sin apart from me, and you can be made alive by grace through faith in me. That radically equalizing message of the gospel does tell us that everyone is a sinner in need of a savior, but also that we have equal worth and value. So when I'm talking about complementarianism, I would align with you and link arms with you to say that that should never justify abuse. That should never justify telling a woman, yeah, sit down, you shouldn't be able to talk about your abuser because complementarianism and you're submitting to your husband. What I think is so interesting and countercultural to what the pagans were teaching at the time in Ephesians 5 is that command to the husband, is that command to the slave owner, rather, and is that command to the father that says, hey, just because you are an adult-free male doesn't mean that you get to subjugate people. It doesn't mean that you get to treat people however you want to. It's actually a much higher calling for the husband to be called to sacrifice his whole self for the wife than it is for the husband to be, or the wife to be called to submit to her husband. Wives are already submitting to their husbands in the pagan culture. That's just how it was. But now God is adding something else. He says, you have to be willing to lay your life down. And when it comes to slavery, again, reminding that slave owner, you've also got a master in heaven. I don't see that as prescribing slavery as a good institution. I do see that as putting a very countercultural restriction and definition around how Christians manage that relationship.
Do you believe that slavery is permissible at any time?
No.
Okay, so that's the problem. So it's not just, oh, I'm going to put a boundary up. If we're arguing that these are absolute 100% of the time, then we can't make an exception to say, oh, just this one time, because you're already doing it, I'm going to let you have slaves, just be nice to them. It has to be one or the other. If we believe that God is all good, if we believe that slavery is not permissible at any time, then that allowance pulls into question that entire chapter. But the bigger problem, I think, is I totally agree with you about Jesus's radical elevation of women. It's my favorite thing about him, to come into a culture where these women were nothing but property. They could be legally sold into sex slavery. They had no vote. They couldn't testify. To have Mary Magdalene as his first apostle of the resurrection in a time where she couldn't testify in a court of law. Beautiful. Wow. The problem is how it ends up in practice. Conservative Christianity demonizes feminism a lot. Feminism is the only reason you and I are sitting here. And the problem is that I think feminism and that divine equality, that divine spiritual authority is affirmed in both Christ and Paul. And so to demonize it, especially in the church, we saw the Southern Baptist Convention just got together in Florida to vote that no woman can have pastor in her name at all, or they will disfellowship the church. It passed this year. If it passes again next year, it will be in the constitution of the SBC. Meanwhile, we have Christ working so hard to elevate women, to elevate their voices. We have Paul affirming it. But now in the church, the way that complementarianism shows up is you need to sit in the church and be quiet. You can't lead. You can't teach. And so often, from a practical standpoint, the language of it sounds great. But in practice, it leads to systems of abuse. We've seen widespread child abuse in the church because of these systems of hierarchy and authority. The church itself is a patriarchal structure that says men are appointed to lead, that the word of God comes from men down to you. I think of Bill Gothard's umbrella of authority. And so what it does is it creates a system that protects those people at the top and not the people at the bottom. And I think that the church has failed to respond to those abuses and to the way that system lends itself to abuse. And that is the problem. The church refuses to elevate women the way that Jesus and Paul did. The church also refuses to address how a system of patriarchy within itself is leading to the abuse and subjugation of women. Do you feel that women should be able to lead in the church?
I think that there are roles for women to lead. I've been to SBC churches my entire life. I go to what is considered a conservative Baptist church, and I feel very loved and supported there. And I would never vie for the role of pastorate. I do believe that that is reserved for men. It's not because I've said a lot that I don't have the capacity to teach, or I don't have the capacity to preach. It's not about capability. No. It's not about my inherent capacity, but I do believe it's about calling. And we could get into like the different interpretations of Titus 2 and 2 Timothy 2:12 and all of that. But when it comes to what you're talking about, this patriarchal structure that really needs, and you can tell me if I'm trying to put words in your mouth because I'm not trying to, but it sounds like what you're saying is that the church needs the feminism that was represented by Jesus to kind of dismantle that system that has run cover for abusers and has really subjugated women. What I would say is that both of us, again, are on the same page when it comes to abuse is wrong, subjugation is wrong. Anything that is used as a cover up for abuse and sin is wrong, no matter how religious or good it sounds. Jesus is the answer to that. Feminism isn't the answer to that. Of course, feminism is demonized. And what's demonized about feminism is not the idea that men and women have equal value or that we're both made in the image of God. What is demonized about feminism from people like me is the propagation of abortion, is the belief that men and women are interchangeable, that we are essentially the same. The idea, this isn't true about all feminists certainly, of the demonization of staying at home as a wife and a mom.
Or
And so
dad.
there are different parts of feminism that I would say are unhealthy. Insofar as any ideology agrees with Christ, I'm going to say, I agree with that. I'm still not going to call myself a feminist because of all of these other things that I really believe are damaging. And as a Christian, I believe are anti-biblical.
So the idea that feminism demonizes having a husband and children is categorically false. The point that feminism is trying to make is that forced motherhood is a problem. It's the same thing with the abortion argument. I am pro-choice, but I would also love for abortions to cease to exist. It means there's no more for incest. People have access to contraception. There's no fatal fetal abnormalities, ectopic pregnancies. None of that is happening. That would be lovely. But I do not think I have the right to obligate someone's body to go through it. And also, coming from a feminist standpoint, again, this is not, well, we're equal and made in the image of God. That's not the argument feminists make. Feminism makes that politically, socially, and economically we're equal, which means that my civil rights don't change when I cross state lines. If I'm assaulted by a man in Texas and he impregnates me if I live there, I am forced to carry that with me through that. My civil rights should not change when I cross state lines. That is the equality being asked by feminism when it comes to the political sphere. And there is no demonization of marriage and children, which is why we vote for things like universal childcare and healthcare and Medicaid, so that we can help kids that get here, even if their parents are ready.
I tell
Even if
you.
it was, oh my goodness, I didn't expect this.
It's
I was
hard.
born for this, or he had a vasectomy, whatever the reason is, we vote for programs to catch those people. The problem is forced. When you talk about, again, the conservative movement, and I love your thoughts on this, the conservative movement's push to take away the 19th Amendment. And I don't see mainstream conservative Christians pushing back on that. That is a social political equality that is now being threatened because of this institution. And again, directly in what I would say is conflict of Christ's desire to elevate women. We have that as a first problem, but it's really about feminism having equality across the board and making sure that women can choose marriage and children if they want, or they can choose not to. Not that that's their only option, by cutting off their access to a vote or their access to education or their access to the workforce in various ways, but also allowing them things like contraception so that they can choose to responsibly plan when and how they have their families.
We disagree on abortion being a civil right. And that is exactly why you see the demonization of feminism, because your equality boils down to the right to kill your child inside the womb. You don't believe in the inherent rights of baby girls not to be murdered. That is the problem that most Christians have with feminism. Again, it's not the belief that we are all equal in worth. It's how it works that out and how you actually define a right. And then when it comes to the 19th Amendment, I would say that that is a very fringe part of the right that I really don't see making its way into the mainstream. I don't even see that on my timeline. I think I've talked about it twice on my show when I did see it come up, and I pushed back on someone who was actually trying to make that argument. I don't think that that is something that is taking hold in the conservative movement even slightly. But it really is about what is the answer? What is the answer to all of the abuses that you're talking about, to the toxicity that you're talking about, much of which I would agree with is a problem. The answer to me isn't feminism. I was going to say two more words, but that's okay.
And I disagree that abortion is a civil right. We're not talking about me coming out and harming someone. What we are doing is me not choosing to allow my organs to be used. If I have a full-grown adult child who needs bone marrow, and for whatever reason I choose not to give it, I cannot be legally compelled to sacrifice that bone marrow. You can't take my organs from me when I'm dead unless I consent when I'm alive to give my organs. That is why that is a civil right. Is you cannot commandeer my organs, my body, or my life for any reason other than what I choose.
Yeah,
that's why that distinction matters. And also with feminism, again, it's not about restricting families or shrinking families. It's about making sure that everyone has the opportunity, not just at life, but quality of life for everyone involved. The life happening in a womb does not supersede the life carrying it.
Wow, this is wild. So again, coming back to the conversation I was having with my eldest daughter just a couple hours ago, she was feeling an overall subjugation about the Bible, right? She's not Christian. She's agnostic. And it saddened me a bit that, her overall impression of the Bible was, it was patriarchy. It was supporting that, and supporting the idea of her being less than. And I'm not sure I did a very good job of convincing her otherwise, but I was really disappointed in Allie saying that she couldn't be a minister or a pastor, that like she had to stay in her lane. And, as you may have picked up, right, that I'm Swedenborgian, but there's two Swedenborgian churches. There's the convention one that I'm part of, and then there's the general church. The general church, the conservative one, doesn't allow female ministers, doesn't allow LGBTQ ministers. Whereas on the convention side, we got lots of female LGBTQ ministers. I would argue possibly more than most on a percentage basis. And it is such a beautiful thing when anyone, male, female, LGBTQ, has a calling to be of service and to preach love. And, that's why I so easily cry at ordinations. But I do have to kind of step back and admit, right, these are ordinations into my theology, where I think is the highest truth. Would I necessarily feel that moved about another straight male being ordained into the Southern Baptist Church? No, I don't think I would be so moved. In fact, I would probably be thinking there's another person going out to spread lies. And yet, I have my opinions, they have their opinions. As I mentioned before, the Baptist Church, I think maybe it's the Baptist Evangelical, I'm not sure exactly which one, they took the time to pass a rule to say that you should ignore near-death experiences or just kind of like put those aside and, it's just all about the Bible. And yeah, I agree. There's some inconsistencies among the NDEs, but the consistencies align a lot with what Swedenborg was writing about the afterworld. So I suppose I do have an inherent bias coming into this. If Allie is with the Southern Baptist Church, there's probably a lot of things that we disagree with. But it is unfortunate that she doesn't feel that there's a path for her if she had the calling. So I am trying to reconcile this issue on how I wish that Allie had a path to become a minister or a pastor. regardless of her chromosomes, regardless of her being a woman. And yet, knowing that she has a lot of differing views than me, and, my snarky comment about there goes another person spreading lies. I think, I think it actually does come down to freedom and equality. And even though I have disagreements with some of Allie's beliefs, I do kind of wish that, she had the freedom to be ordained. I think ultimately it's the lesser evil, actually. It's the lesser evil. I would rather see her having the freedom to become ordained and to be the minister of a church, even if she's saying things that I disagree with, than for her to, in some ways, perpetuate this glass ceiling, this rule, this patriarchy that says, only men are suitable to be ministers or pastors. I mean, the previous president of our entire denomination was female. This should not be a foreign concept. But yeah, we see it in politics as well. Of the fact that United States has never had a female president is really an embarrassment. Someday. All right, let's get back to it.
My next claim is Christians cannot affirm same-sex marriage.
So marriage is defined as a formal union between two people that is a legal contract, a social institution, and a personal commitment. It is not inherently religious. So marriage actually predates Christianity by quite a long ways. It first starts appearing at 4350 BCE, and then it's written into Mesopotamian law around 2350 BCE. The oldest Old Testament writings start to show up between 1400 BCE and 1200 BCE. So it's not inherently religious. So the same way that Christians can understand that they have a personal belief around religion and around marriage, they can also admit and honor other people's decisions with their own marriages, and also don't have ground to stand on to prevent people from going into a legal contract with the state. And in the 20th century, evangelicals in America did not really have a particular opinion on abortion overall as a voting bloc. It really didn't matter. In fact, in the early 70s, the SBC released three church-wide edicts supporting the passage of Roe, that a woman's bodily autonomy was supreme, that for her mental, physical, and spiritual health, that abortion should be on the table in all or some cases. So really, for the bulk of church history, Christians have in some form or another affirmed abortion. Are you saying that all of those people were not Christians?
This segment and this claim is about same-sex marriage. My claim is not even about the legislation of same-sex marriage. My position, that is different than someone who would call themselves maybe a progressive Christian rather, is that a Christian cannot affirm as holy, good, and right same-sex marriage. We can have a separate conversation about the legislation. There are different conservative Christians that actually can maybe disagree on what the state's role is in defining and sanctioning marriage. But when it comes to the position of a Christian, I do not believe that it is biblically viable to support the idea that same-sex marriage is moral and good and right and holy. And it's not just because of a few verses in Leviticus. It's not only because of one or two verses in the New Testament, although I believe that those are valid. It's really about what God from the very beginning in Genesis 1 calls good and right and holy. And there are no examples in scripture of calling anything other than a relationship between one man and one woman good and right and holy. It's rooted in creation. It's reiterated throughout scripture. It's repeated by Jesus. It's represented in Christ in the church, and it's reflective of the gospel. So that is my position. I don't know if you agree with that. I know that you don't consider yourself a conservative Christian, but it's more of a theological one than a political one.
So when you say you're basing it on creation, are you basing it on the creation account in Genesis 1 or Genesis 2?
Genesis 1:27, that God created them male and female in his image. He created them male and female. He created them. And so I don't know if you are arguing that Genesis 2 does not create Adam and Eve and doesn't create male and female. Yes, there are two different renderings of the same account, but that's where it starts. And actually, it doesn't even matter in this particular case if someone believes in the literal creation account or if they believe it's some kind of metaphor. When it comes to this particular point, that God created only one form of marriage to be good, right, and holy, and Christians don't have an option biblically to think otherwise, then the creation account that we have, whether it's Genesis 1 or Genesis 2, supports that.
Well, I bring that up because Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are two different creation accounts. So if we're going to argue from biblical inerrancy and that all of the Bible applies to all Christians as it is now, we have to deal with those errors. The fact that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 cannot both be true. They're two totally different creation narratives. But you bring up the Old Testament verses and the New Testament verses that are typically used in this argument. However, in Leviticus 21, Deuteronomy 21, Deuteronomy 25, in the law, as God is giving the law to the Israelites, he gives permissions on how men should take multiple wives. So he's not just sanctioning one man, one woman, one lifetime. He's actually sanctioning in the law that they claim in that text that God is giving to them. He is sanctioning multiple wives. So do we agree with polygamy? Also within those laws, again, we're basing it on the Old Testament has to be infallible. These laws have to hold. That first disrupts the narrative of it's not one man, one woman, one lifetime. There are actual laws given according to the text by God to man that a man can take multiple wives.
No, I don't believe that Old Testament law should apply to America or to Christians today. And that's not the argument that I make. I don't think any Christian believes that we are supposed to abide by all of the cleansing ceremonial laws of the Old Testament, the moral laws that we see Jesus double down upon, the moral laws that are fulfilled in Christ and that are reiterated in the New Testament. The 10 Commandments is one of those, then yes, Christians do believe that we should abide by that. But biblical inerrancy doesn't have to do with Christians believing that all of the Old Testament law
You speak for all the Christians,
today.
do you?
Your point about the description of taking multiple wives and how that was regulated in Old Testament law, there are a lot of things, I'll just be honest, that are regulated and restricted in Old Testament law that to me, as a modern reader, I'm like, why didn't you just get rid of it? Like, why didn't you just abolish it? We could have a whole conversation about why God culturally did the things that he did or said the things that he did in the Old Testament. I would say my argument is bigger than that. It spans all the way from Genesis 1 to Revelation 20. We read something really stunning in Ephesians 5 when we read that Christ is the head of the church, just as the husband is the head of the wife. And Christ gave himself up for the church as the husband is to give himself up and sacrifice himself for the wife. That the husband and wife combination is actually a reflection and representation of the eternal reality that Christians believe in, the marriage between the groom, which is Christ, and the bridegroom, the bride, which is the church. And there's really no way around that. Even Jesus in Matthew 19:4-5, when he's answering a question to the Pharisees about divorce, he goes all the way back to creation. He said, have you not read that in the beginning, he made them male and female, and the male shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So it seems like Jesus took the Old Testament account of creation very seriously and believed that it had moral application to the definition of marriage. I hear progressives say a lot, Jesus had nothing to say about sexuality, nothing to say about marriage, nothing to say about gender. He did. He was very clear in that passage what marriage and gender is. And again, I just don't see a way around that as a Christian.
So a couple things here. So first, the Old Testament polygamy allowance is important because it debunks the claim that this was God's intended rule. If that was God's intended rule, God would have passed that in those laws that he was giving people. And then in Matthew 19, Jesus is asked a very direct question. He is asked, can a man divorce his wife for any reason? It would be crazy for Jesus to give any other answer than to answer the question that he's been given. So he answers about a man and a woman being married. The question is not, can a man marry another man? Can a man do this? Are these relationships viable? That's not actually the question. The question is, can a man leave his wife for any reason? Because again, the Old Testament law allowed for a man to get rid of a woman for any reason. If he was tired of her, didn't like her cooking, he could throw her out, get rid of her, and divorce her. Jesus upends that law by saying, absolutely not. You can't leave her to be destitute. He changes it. And it's such a drastic change for the disciples that in the next few verses, the disciples say, if this is the way it is to be between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry. They were so shocked by Jesus withdrawing that permission to divorce for any reason that they were stunned by it. So again, it clearly states that people didn't understand God's intent clearly, obviously, if that's what you're saying. If that's not how the ancient Israelites, who the law was written for, who Genesis was written for, was actually understood it. That's how they understood it to mean. When we talk about context, it can't just be the context of a passage. We have to look at it, to your point, in historical context. They didn't understand it that way. So now you're working off a different interpretation, which is fine, but people are allowed different interpretations. I don't think that you
Not
have the
according to her.
authority to say who is Christian, who is not. This is not
She's
part of
trying to.
salvation for people. We can't say you're not a Christian if you affirm same-sex marriage, because then we're saying you can't access salvation because I say you can't if you affirm these things. So it's very clear. Jesus then in the next few verses talks about eunuchs who were the sexual outliers of that culture. That's your intersex people. That's everyone who doesn't fit in for whatever reason. Some of them are castrated. They do not fit. Many of them were extremely promiscuous. Jesus is not only aware of them, but he affirms them as being fit for the kingdom of heaven. So it's not a question. Jesus is not talking about same sex there. He's talking about something totally different. Clearly, they did not understand marriage to be one man, one woman, one lifetime, and it's their ancient holy text. And then lastly, we do not get to say what allows Christians to be saved or to be real Christians. Many Christians affirm you are working off your interpretation of scripture. Other people are allowed theirs.
I didn't say anything about someone's salvation, and I didn't say the claim is not that you are not a Christian if you affirm this. It's that I don't believe Christians have a biblical leg to stand on to affirm this based on scripture. If we go back to that Matthew 19 passage, as I said, and agree with you, he is talking about divorce. My argument wasn't that they came up to him and was like, hey, what do you think about the LGBTQ movement? Obviously, that's not what's going on. My argument is that Jesus positively defines marriage and gender in one way by appealing to creation. He says, have you not read? And when you're saying, you know, he did away with what they thought about divorce, or he did away with that law, he's actually doing what he does over and over again. When it comes to adultery, when it comes to murder, he's saying, you don't understand. This was always about your heart. This was always about putting God first. This was always about worshiping God. It's actually not enough that you don't just commit adultery. If you lust after a woman in your heart, you have already committed adultery. It's not enough that you don't murder someone. If you hate someone in your heart, you have already committed murder. He's doing the same thing when it comes to this. He actually says in that passage, he says, look, we never wanted divorce. God never wanted divorce, but we allowed it because of your hardness of heart, because of Israel's hardness of heart. And so he's appealing to creation there. He's going back to God's heart. He's saying this is how it was always meant to be. And that comment about eunuchs, I don't read Jesus saying something about intersex or anything there. I actually think he's being a little sarcastic when they say, like, how could we even be married? And he's like, some people are called to be eunuchs. Like, you could be castrated if that's one of your options. He's probably being part serious and part sarcastic there. But the point is that he positively defines marriage as God defines it in the Old Testament. Also, as we see in Romans 1, as we see in 1 Corinthians 6, as we see in Ephesians 5, as we see in the marriage supper between Christ and the church.
So if Ephesians 6:5 says slaves obey your masters, do you believe that that's applicable to Christians today?
I don't think that anyone should be owned. If we look at Philemon, we look at the Old Testament, and we look at Ephesians 6, specifically Ephesians 6, I think would have been so countercultural at the time to say not only slaves obey your masters, not just by, lip service, but actually obey them, but also masters, remember that your master is also in heaven. So how you treat your slave matters. I think that all of those verses about husbands loving and sacrificing for their wives, and fathers not provoking their children, and slave owners being kind to their slaves actually speaks to something very countercultural to how God saw people as made in his image and the equalizing nature of the gospel.
And the reason I bring that up is because, again, we're arguing that the Bible is the reason that Christians can't affirm same-sex people, even though we know so much more about the human experience now than we did back then. But we have a Bible that allows for slavery. In the New Testament, they don't get rid of it. They don't say no more of this. And if we agree that, God, gave you these laws because of your hardness of hearts, God succumbed and humiliated himself in front of humans because they wouldn't do what was right, then that doesn't make any sense. And again, Jesus is not limiting marriage. It is not prescriptive for the limitation of marriage. He is directly answering the exact question that they asked him. And again, these are documented words of Christ in the gospel, written way long after his death, but it does not exclude same-sex partners. And the reason I brought up people's salvation is, again, you're making the claim that Christians cannot affirm same-sex marriage. So the inverse of that is you can't be a Christian and affirm same-sex marriage. That's making a claim on someone's salvic status for a thing that is not in the creeds and not in the salvation order at all.
You can't be a Christian and affirm same-sex marriage and be correct. That is the claim. All of us are going to die,
Just
every
change the claim
denomination
again.
of Christian, every true believer, having some part of our theology wrong. All of us who are going to heaven will go to heaven not being right about everything, because we are not inerrant and we are not infallible. I would say when it comes to the biblical support, it's not only the creation account. It's not only Jesus's words, which I do believe are not just descriptive, but also prescriptive. But it's also when we look at something like Romans 1, we're not just looking at pederasty. We're not just looking at marriage. We actually see that the attraction, even the desire in Romans 1, we read, is unnatural. It's actually something that points to a form of depravity, God through Paul says in Romans 1. And so I think Christians have a very firm foundation biblically, if we are to believe in the Bible as authoritative at all, to say, yeah, gosh, the only holy form of matrimony that we see explicitly throughout Scripture is between one man and one woman.
So especially with Romans 1, that's in the concept. Oh, is that mine?
Wow, I didn't know I was going to have so much to say about this. Like, this is just flowing. Like, wasn't I just talking about LGBTQ a few moments ago? And then, boom, there it is. I'll start with Emanuel Swedenborg, who, talks a lot about, the beauty of marriage and heaven and such. And, and he even talks about sex and sexuality a bit and never condemns homosexuality. In fact, he doesn't say anything at all. It's almost a little eerie how he doesn't say anything about it at all. And yet there are a few times that he says that there are some things he's learned that he's not allowed to write about. Maybe it would just upset the apple cart too much. So we know that there's a certain amount of homosexuality behavior that's exhibited in, I don't know, a third of animals. I don't know the number. But it exists out there in the natural kingdom. And it exists in humans. The way I look at it is this. If you are trying to give a pitch presentation and you're trying to just summarize the norm, you don't go into the nuances and a few of the variations, because that's not a summary anymore. You need to cover off what, your listener, your audience is going to most relate to. And so by Jesus talking about marriage between the man and the woman, right? It's 90% of the people out there, that's what they're going to do. And so there's not really a need or a mandate to talk about the variations. And that's an interesting thing about the eunuch bit. But there is something that I have been wondering about for some time. One of my daughters, she said that the Bible was changed, that originally this line, maybe it was Leviticus, that says man shall not lie with man, originally said man shall not lie with boy. And it was actually condemning pedophilia, not homosexuality. And I'm kind of surprised that this was not mentioned. Maybe it's not true. We're going to find out together. Is there any evidence that suggests the Bible originally said man shall not lie with boy, but it was changed to say man shall not lie with man? And we'll have it put its thinking cap on. There is some evidence behind the claim, but not quite in the form the claim is usually presented. The important distinction is this. There's no good evidence that the original Hebrew Bible said man shall not lie with a boy, and that scribes later changed it, man shall not lie with man. There is evidence that some later translators and interpreters understood the passage as referring specifically to a boy. And this interpretation influenced certain Bible translations. The Hebrew Bible says, the passage people usually mean, Leviticus, okay. The Hebrew noun, zakar, the Hebrew text is approximately, can't read that. Literally, the critical word zakar means male rather than specifically man or specifically boy. It can refer to males. It can refer to males generally, including children. Okay, here's where it gets lost in English. Hebrew male is not necessarily an adult man, but that doesn't mean the original Hebrew contained the word boy. There's no Hebrew word for boy, in the verse. There really was a boy. Went too far. There really was a boy translation tradition. This is the fascinating part. A 2025 article, Jewish Bible Quarterly, traces the history of the wording and argues that boy entered the translation tradition in medieval German Bible translations rather than being presented in the Hebrew. According to his reconstruction, certain German translations began the rendering as name in boy. Martin Luther subsequently used boy in both Leviticus 18:22. Oh, curious. So Luther's German Bible did essentially contain, you shall not lie with a boy as with a woman. Hollenbach argues that Luther was influenced by earlier German translations rather than the translating these directly from the Hebrew. Gotcha, right. That is real historical evidence for the boy wording, but it is evidence around the translation history, not evidence that the Hebrew was altered, right? And Christians throw out so much of the Old Testament, even if it said, do not lie with male as one lies with a woman, you're going to choose that, but say, the slavery and the rape and such was wrong. This was much closer to the Hebrew vocabulary, man shall not lie with man, was boy an ancient interpretation? Yes, there is evidence that ancient interpreters sometimes understood the passage in terms of adult men and younger males. A scholarly survey of historical critical literature notes that Philo of Alexandria interpreted Leviticus in connection with pederasty, adult men with younger males. But that's different from saying that the original Hebrew said boy. It didn't. The evidence looks more like it was male, and interpretations potentially said male. Some said boy. Others said man, male. Okay. Interesting. All right. So I'll say from that little side quest there, probably not accurate to say that it was like deliberately changed from boy to man, that it was always male with male. But some earlier interpretations did see it as man with boy, and then that was changed back to man. But I think, overall, given how much of the Old Testament is disregarded by Christians, including myself, it doesn't really seem to have much merit. I mean, I honestly think that, the conservative right's emphasis on homosexuality and trans people, it's a bit of a distraction. I don't see this small minority having that much of an impact on our lives, and yet the frequency that it's brought up, it just seems like it's being exaggerated, perhaps exaggerated to create division that doesn't necessarily need to exist. Now let's just talk briefly about the same-sex marriage, because one thing that they didn't really get into was the sex part of it. I mean, she did talk about adultery a little bit, but that's a lot of what marriage is. Whether you're talking about a man and a woman or some other combination, it's fidelity. Effing fidelity. And that aspect, I think, has much more weight than whether it's a homo or heterosexual relationship, right? Like, most of us are pre-programmed to have some sexual drive. And, it's what keeps the human species populating. We would not be here today if it was not a strong drive as it is. And when two people are committing that element of their human experience together, and they're making this commitment in marriage to bond together in this way permanently, I think that desire to limit your, sexual freedom, sexual exploration to a single person in marriage, hypothetically for the rest of your life, has far more weight and heavenly influence than whether it's a homosexual relationship or a heterosexual relationship. I do not think that we're at any risk of, running out of people because everybody's going to turn gay all of a sudden and then, nobody's making babies. I feel that these are just, they're natural but rare abnormalities in our, typical sexual relationships. And it's like they're can't even say it. Normal abnormalities. Really. It doesn't affect me like some would make it seem like it's affecting us. And I got to tell you, if you haven't read the Gospel of Thomas and how it talks about like man becoming woman and woman becoming man, you should check that out. That'll spin you out. I got to tell you, like, some of our gay ministers are so kind, are such beautiful people that, I'm glad that the Swedenborgian Convention gave them a path to explore their ministry and their meditation and their connection with humanity. And, to me, I think, somebody who maintains fidelity in a marriage, like, that is far more important than whether they're straight or not. Really. Okay. I think that's all I got to say on that. Let's get back to the debate.
Face-off claim. America invented separation of church and state. We are not and will never be a Christian nation.
What do you mean by Christian nation? Can you define that?
I'm using the Christian nationalist definition that America is inherently and fundamentally based on the Christian identity. Therefore, the government should be promoting and asserting Christian identity and values through civil life and legislation.
And when you say that America invented the separation of church and state, what do you mean by that?
The Constitution is actually the first constitution that doesn't take its law from God or deities. It doesn't mention God, deities, Jesus anywhere in the Constitution. What it does is it actually says that we, the people, are the ones agreeing on this Constitution for the justice and welfare of all people. The Constitution doesn't mention God at all. It only mentions religion in Article 6, Clause 3, where it says that no religious test will be given to hold office or public trust.
What do you make of the references to the Creator and nations God and God several times throughout the Declaration of Independence?
The Declaration is not a founding document. It doesn't establish any government or laws. It is a severance document from an old institution. But also, because many of the founding fathers were deists, it is deist language to believe that some god or creator did create the earth, but then stepped away and allows it to function on its own and via free will. Specifically, their creator, which is the actual phrase used, is a specific deist comment that no matter what creator you believe in, it is your creator, but it's a common deist use.
Do you believe that I adhere to what you call the Christian nationalist definition of what it means to be a Christian nation?
That depends on if you believe that Christian law should be enforced based on religious beliefs, strictly from the Bible, and influencing Christian religion inside public institutions.
Here's what I would say. I would say that most of the founders, most of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, most of the people who did craft the founding documents for our country, some were deists, some were actual Christians. I would completely agree with you that there was no establishment of a particular religion. There was no establishment of a national denomination. The separation of church and state, of course, doesn't actually appear in the Constitution or in the Declaration of Independence. It appears first in a letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptists. And of course, his primary motivation in saying that is a good one. I think something that we agree on is that the church should also be protected from the state. That was what the Danbury Baptists were worried about at the time, that the state was trying to infringe upon their rights and their liberty. And I think that sometimes gets lost in the conversation when we're talking about the separation of church and state. I also believe that the separation of church and state, which is a principle that I also agree with, and also agree with what you say, that we don't have an establishment of a national religion, sometimes gets conflated with the influence of religion in law, in legislation. My argument would be that you can't really get out of that. It's not that I believe that we should establish a theocracy. I don't believe that the government should come in and make you believe what I believe, or go to church like I go to church, or talk like I talk, or pray like I pray. But it's impossible to create legislation in a vacuum. It's impossible to create a law outside of a moral worldview. I think the founders believed that, which is why they said we're endowed by our creator with certain unalienable rights, among them being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We don't have to agree on everything denominationally. We don't have to agree on everything theologically to at least agree that, okay, our founding principles seem to be that we were given rights by our creator. They seem to believe that there was a moral lawgiver that tells us what is right and what is wrong. And as we create legislation, we are trying to figure out what that is. I would say the progressive secularist brings their worldview, their religious or quasi-religious views to the table when they are writing legislation about gender or writing legislation about abortion. And my belief is that Christians also have the right and the responsibility to bring the fullness of our worldview into the public square, into the voting booth. It doesn't mean that you have to agree. It doesn't mean that the vote is going to win. We might not persuade enough people to come to our position on abortion or gender or whatever it is.
You want abortion,
but we do have the right and responsibility to do that. And I do find it to be, and I don't know if you've made this claim, but a little hypocritical when I see someone saying, oh, it's Christian nationalist for a Christian to say, well, this is my view on abortion, and I believe abortion is murder, therefore I believe that it should be illegal. But then when the progressive comes in and says, well, I actually believe that life starts, or the value of life starts at 20 weeks gestation. Why is that particular view that is being written into legislation in some states less of a religious nationalist view than the Christian who says, I disagree, and I'm going to bring my worldview into the voting booth? So that's where I see just some kind of discrepancy when it comes to the argument. It seems like only conservative Christians are told to leave the fullness of our worldview at the door before we vote.
So a lot of talking points in there that I want to address. But the first is that you say, well, it doesn't appear in the founding documents. Neither does a fair trial or checks and balances. But we know these to be inherent characteristics of the American government. And the founding fathers were so clear. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, author of the Bill of Rights, wrote in an 1822 letter to Edward Livingston saying that religion and government will act with more purity the less they are mixed. A wall works both ways. So it does protect the church from the state. The Baptists being, persecuted by the Congregationalists, right? It protects them. It also protects, the state from a theocratic enforcement. And we see that with Christian nationalists. Again, I don't think this is a claim you've made, but Doug Wilson, people like that who are saying, I want to establish a theocracy. That's where we start to head into troubling waters. And of course, every single person, no matter their faith or their worldview, is going to bring that into the voting booth. But religion is a fence that I place on my lawn. It is not a fence I can place on your lawn. So when I start to make legislation or vote for bills that enforce my belief that is strictly my religious belief on other people, where now you have to follow my belief system instead of, I can't participate in that, I can't do that, I don't believe in that for my religion, then you start to actually infringe on the religious
Gosh,
liberties of
religion is
others.
so
And that's where we have
pervasive,
to create
though.
that
Like, you
separation.
could say,
And my
well,
concern with
religion
conservative Christians as a movement
applies
right
to
now
every
is you
side.
have a lot of Doug Wilsons, and you have a lot of people saying we're going to take the 19th Amendment. And there is no rebuke from the rest of Christian conservatives saying absolutely not. We value civil liberties. We value differences in religious beliefs. We value this ability to live and believe differently. But if you start to legislate that change, or in Texas, you start to put the 10 Commandments on the wall without regard to any other religion, that now children of other religions are being forced to be exposed to a religion that their family may not agree with. And I think that that's something that should take place in the home with the parents. That
Yeah, I mean,
parents
well,
should
it's
be
been
entrusted
exposed. You're
with
like
giving that worldview
promoting
in a
it
religious sense
in
to their
a
children.
public
So
school.
I don't think there is, if a progressive comes in and says, well, I believe this. Again, what is the parameter of that belief? Is it a religious belief? Is it based on a spiritual text? Is it only based in that religion? Or is there actual data? Is there actual information that's influencing that decision? And then that opens up a broader argument for the welfare and justice of people.
When it comes to the 10 Commandments, I would say it is necessary to understand the 10 Commandments to understand Western civilization and to understand America. So there actually is, I think, a secular, academic, and intellectual argument to be made for the 10 Commandments. We agree, however, on the separation of church and state. I wasn't saying that that wasn't an important principle. I was pointing out that sometimes it gets lost in the conversation that that is also for the protection of the church, and it doesn't negate the importance of a worldview or of religious beliefs in the public sphere, because as you said, it's inevitable. And I do wonder if you can clarify a little bit, like what the parameter is. You said your religious beliefs are a fence on your own lawn, not a fence that you can put on other people's lawn. But I can think of Christians who have had to abide by beliefs that are not theirs. I think, for example, about Jack Phillips. He's the cake baker out of Colorado, Masterpiece Cake Shop. He said, look, I just can't make a cake that celebrates a gay wedding. I'll make you a cake, but it goes against my religious beliefs. Well, the state of Colorado came after him, and it was only after over a decade of litigation, and his case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, that finally the Supreme Court said, okay, you've got a First Amendment right to be able to, express your artistic creativity the way that you want to in a way that aligns with your values. Mm-hmm. I could go on and on. Jessica Bates, she is a mom out of Oregon. She tried to adopt some kids out of foster care, and they said, look, if you don't abide by what we believe about LGBTQ ideology, then you can't adopt. So everywhere, I actually see progressives using what I would call their quasi-religious beliefs and say, no, these are neutral. We're enforcing them via legislation. Mm-hmm. And if you don't abide by them, then you're a bigot. Then you'll get in trouble. So that's what I don't really understand. Why is it Christian nationalism or a theocracy for me to say, here's my belief about abortion. I do think it should be reflected in law, versus when, say, a progressive does the same thing from their perspective.
Yeah. So first, and abortion kind of keeps coming back into the topic, but first, abortion, we're actually talking about people's organs, whether or not people will face death in an event like pregnancy. We are talking about whether someone has the right to choose if their organs are used for a specific purpose or not. That's a very personal, deeply intrinsic decision. So if I'm coming to you and saying, this is what you have to do with your body, that's a very different conversation, especially around religion. And again, religion, when we look at Christian conservatism, they're constantly making appeals to the Bible and to God. That is what makes this religious action. They are actually claiming it comes from the Bible. I believe this should be law because it's in the Bible. That's where that religious infringement happens. And I agree with you that while I don't agree ethically with a baker saying, I can't make you a cake, I do agree that people should be able to abide by their religious convictions. The problem is that we don't have laws that really clarify what discrimination looks like in a public versus a private space. So for instance, with the cake baker, I think that conversation in a private business is their decision to make. I don't have to agree with it. They have a First Amendment right to make that claim. However, in the public sphere, where these are, state-run facilities like public schools or libraries, that kind of discrimination.
Right. Yeah, you can find another baker, but you have to go to the school.
Because these are public institutions, so they should therefore be open to the public. And I think that's the big difference, is Christian conservatives themselves are making these appeals to the Bible as justification for their actions and justifications for the laws they want to pass without engaging in science or data as an explanation for those laws versus when you look at progressive candidates, for instance, there is typically, here's the data, here's what we know, here's why we're proposing this, and this is how it works.
But we know that's not true. We know what the science says about something like gender. There really is XX and XY. And it's very obvious that a man should not be playing in women's sports. It's an appeal to ideology.
People.
It's an appeal to ideology to say, you know, a person can be small enough, can be young enough that they don't actually have value and rights, and that a person's organ actually trumps the right to life of that little baby. But you do what a lot of progressives do, is claim that their views are coming from a place of data. Their views are always coming from a place of science. Their views are coming from this neutral position, and conservative Christians, ours are just coming from subjective religion, which, yes, I'm not going to lie and say, oh no, God has nothing to do with my perspective on the value of human life. Of course, I believe all people are made in the image of God. Not everyone believes that. That is the thrust of what I believe and is underneath everything I believe. But yes, I can appeal to logic. I can appeal to science to make the argument for why abortion is unethical, wrong, and therefore should be illegal.
Haven't heard it yet.
Or I can definitely appeal to biology, as many non-Christians do, when it comes to the reality of the gender binary, which is the same thing as the reality of the sex binary. And so I just don't think it's quite fair to say progressive candidates are the ones appealing to facts and logic. There's nothing factual or logical by saying that a man can become a woman. You can have that belief, but when you start to legislate that, well, then you're forcing your religious belief on me. You've become your own kind of theocrat. So I just think it should be consistent. Either everyone can bring the fullness of their worldview into legislation and we duke it out and see what wins, or no one can.
So actually, science does say that sex happens on a spectrum. We have people that are intersex. We have people that have XX chromosomes and different genitalia. It happens. We understand that things happen on a spectrum, the same way that we understand more about sexuality than we did in the Iron Age when the Bible was written. So there is actual science. We have athletes who go through these tests and happening in the Olympics that are proving that this doesn't always happen as clean cut as we want to. And we learn more every day. Also, the trans women in sports argument is a little bit inauthentic when conservative Christians have backed off the Epstein files and are refusing to push for those women and those girls to get justice. When the real threat, when we look at the actual data, the threat to young girls is straight adult men. That is the threat. And instead of addressing the threat, we are fear-mongering with trans athletes that make up less than 1% of 1% of the population. It is so few. It is so far between. We don't have records of girls getting injured. We don't have records of girls getting attacked. It's a very disingenuous argument, but science also does show that the intersex argument is not as clean cut as we want. And it also comes down to personal liberty that allow people to live how they want to live. You don't have to agree. You don't have to participate, but to be able to legislate people's civil rights away, like their ability to show up in the world the way they want to, their ability, like in Kansas, to have driver's licenses, then we're definitely entering into other territory of, I don't like that. Therefore, I am going to make sure you can't travel freely. Those type of actions make a very big difference in how that's being legislated in people's lives. I don't have an issue with the disagreement.
When it comes to something like intersex, I want to try to hit on all of your very interesting points as much as I can. When it comes to something like intersex, there are also people that are born with one leg, but we both agree that humans are bipeds. The exception doesn't change the rule. Just because there are people that are born with Turner syndrome or different kind of anomalies doesn't change that as a rule, we are XX and XY. Plus the athletes that we're talking about, the men who decide that they're women and go into women's spaces, they are not even claiming that they have a genetic anomaly or that they are intersex. They are claiming that by declaration and by identity, they are the opposite sex.
You should be fine.
And I want to bring this back to the center of this debate, is that America is not a Christian nation based on that religion, that separation of church and state protects everyone, which means that as we're evaluating beliefs and the claims from Christian conservatives, the Bible should not be the foundation by which we're making those laws. It should be a law of the people, for the people, and by the people. And that means everyone of all religions, all sexes, whoever they love, gets to have equal civil rights, equal liberty under the law. That was it. That was it. See, 16 minutes is nothing.
No, you guys covered a lot.
Good. Once I got the hang of it, it felt less clunky. My first few minutes, I was like, Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're good to go. Do you need anything else from us? I think they want one picture. One picture? Okay.
Whoa. Well, I hope you got something out of it. It was interesting how Allie brought her perspective that everyone should be able to take their worldview to the voting booth, which I almost think is unavoidable. And I'm trying to think of an example where my worldview might conflict or infringe on somebody's rights, and I would take a step back from that and maybe vote against my worldview for the sake of equality. I'm not sure I can. Yeah, I don't think anybody can leave their worldview at the door. That's going to influence their voting. You know, I used to be pro-abortion. Now I'm just pro-choice. For a minute, I do remember adopting the pro-life, anti-abortion perspective. I'm going to say, I feel like this was at the end of high school or shortly after high school. And I feel like I held that belief for, maybe a few months. And I related to this sense of mission, of purpose, of saving lives. And I really got the fervor of the anti-abortion crowd. I mean, I really felt that for a brief time. But after a few months, I think I ultimately came to the decision that this shouldn't be my decision, that this is such a personal choice for that pregnant woman, that for me to support legislation that took away her right to choose, that was the greater evil, because who am I to say what is right for her? And let me just, end on this, that, our freedom, the free will, is such an important part of the human and spiritual experience. And eliminating a woman's right to choose, and I mean, especially as we've seen, like, most of these are happening in the first few weeks. For Allie to suggest, oh, can you kill babies after they're born? This seems like this repeating talking point that the anti-abortionists bring up as if it's a real thing. And it's crazy to think, even in 2026, that anti-abortionists are continuing to throw that out there as if that is a thing. And I kind of get, it's like, well, where do you draw the line? 19 weeks, 20 weeks in this situation, in that situation. And yeah, it's a tough question of where you do draw that line. But I feel like it was being done responsibly, in my opinion, when we had Roe v. Wade, and that retaining, conserving a woman's free will and right to choose is the greater good, not me or anybody else telling her to have this baby. All right. I think that's all I've got to say on that. I really hope that I can get Monte on Crosshatched sometime. Thank you all for watching. Catch you next time. And remember, you can be detached and still subscribe to Crosshatched.